I withdrew 58% of my husband's company in a single morning. $47 million, gone before his board meeting even started. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a CEO's wife became the woman who dismantled his empire with 14 withdrawal notices and a cup of black coffee. My name is Lydia Whitmore, though for 7 years I answered to Lydia Clark. That morning, the morning everything changed, I was standing in my bathrobe holding a piece of my daughter's forgotten violin music when my husband told me he was giving my job to his 23-year-old girlfriend. He said it wasn't personal. He said it was just business. What Daniel didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn in our 7 years of marriage, was that I wasn't just his wife. I wasn't just Emma's mother or the woman who smiled beside him at investor galas. I was the architect of every dollar that flowed through Meridian Holdings. Every institutional investor he bragged about to the press. Every emergency loan that saved him from bankruptcy. Every expansion fund that made him look like a visionary. They were all me. The Singapore Growth Fund? Mine. The Eleanor Trust? Named after my mother. Patriot Capital Ventures? My family's money wearing a different mask. Sterling Investment Group? Also ours. 14 accounts, 14 separate entities, all of them tentacles of the Whitmore family fortune, and all of them under my control. Daniel thought he'd built an empire. What he'd actually done was borrow mine and forget to say thank you. But that morning, standing in my bathrobe with my daughter's sheet music in my hand, watching my husband straighten his tie before destroying my career, I made a decision. I was going to take it all back. Not out of spite, though spite would have been justified. Not even out of anger, though I had plenty of that brewing beneath my carefully maintained surface. No, I was going to take it back because it was mine. It had always been mine. And I was done pretending otherwise. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the morning that started it all, before the withdrawal notices, before the board meeting that changed everything, before Daniel Clark learned the most expensive lesson of his life. The morning light filtered through the bedroom windows with the kind of false warmth that promises nothing and delivers less. I stood there in my bathrobe, still carrying the faint scent of Emma's strawberry shampoo from our morning goodbye hug, watching my husband Daniel adjust his tie in the mirror with the practiced precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His reflection caught mine for just a moment, and in that brief instant, I saw something flicker across his face that I'd been ignoring for months. Maybe years. It wasn't guilt exactly, more like the careful neutrality of someone about to deliver bad news they'd already made peace with. I want you to hear this from me first, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone he used for difficult conversations with investors, the one that suggested reasonableness while offering none. The board approved Sierra Taylor for Chief Strategy Officer. She brings fresh perspective. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and choking. Fresh perspective. The phrase was so carefully chosen, so deliberately vague, that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I felt something inside me go very still and very cold, the way water does just before it freezes solid. This was the position we'd discussed for months. The role I'd been grooming myself for, preparing presentations for, staying up late running financial models to prove I could handle it. The position that was supposed to be mine. Nothing personal, Lydia, he added, reaching for his briefcase. You understand it's just business. Nothing personal. 7 years of marriage reduced to a corporate platitude. 7 years of pouring my family's fortune into his company, of standing beside him at investor galas, of managing the financial architecture that made his success possible. All of it dismissed with the same casual indifference someone might use to mention they were changing dry cleaners. I smiled. I actually smiled, feeling my face arrange itself into an expression of pleasant acceptance that felt like wearing a mask. Of course, I heard myself say, I understand completely. And I did understand. That was the terrible part. I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. I understood that this wasn't really about Sierra's qualifications or fresh perspectives. I understood that my husband had made his choice and it wasn't me. I understood that every late-night meeting, every mysterious charge on the company card, every time Caroline had avoided my eyes in the office, it had all been leading to this moment. Daniel kissed my cheek, the gesture perfunctory and distant, before heading for the door. I listened to his Tesla pull out of the driveway, the electric motor making that distinctive whir that always reminded me of money. My family's money, to be precise. The Whitmore fortune that had built everything he took credit for. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I walked to my home office with steps that felt strangely light, as if I'd been carrying a heavy weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to move freely. My hands were completely steady as I opened my laptop and pulled up the investment portfolios. 14 separate accounts, each one meticulously structured, each one hiding in plain sight as independent institutional investors. This is where most people would have cried. Where they would have called their mother or their sister, collapsed onto the floor in a heap of betrayal and broken promises. But I came from a long line of Whitmore women who'd learned that tears were a luxury you couldn't afford when someone was trying to take what was yours. My grandmother had secretly managed my grandfather's investments while he took credit for their wealth. My mother had built our family fortune while my father played golf and attended club meetings. And now me, funding Daniel's empire while he gave my promotion to a woman barely out of business school. The pattern was supposed to end with me. I pulled up the first account. The Singapore Growth Fund, $8 million strategically positioned to look like overseas investment. In reality, it was Whitmore money filtered through my mother's connections in Asia, money I'd personally negotiated and structured during Emma's third-grade year when Daniel was convinced the company was going to fold. I'd made 3 phone calls from our kitchen table, moved funds between family trusts, and by morning, Meridian Holdings had its lifeline. The press release had credited Daniel's brilliant negotiation with international investors. The international investor had been me, sitting in my pajamas, drinking chamomile tea. My phone buzzed. Caroline, Daniel's assistant. The woman who'd been leaving me breadcrumbs for months, though I'd chosen to ignore them until now. I didn't answer. Not yet. First, I needed to see exactly how deep this betrayal went. I opened my email and searched for Sierra Taylor's name. The first result was from 6 months ago, an invoice for consulting services. $700,000 paid to S. Taylor Associates over that period. Strategic advisory services. Market analysis. Business development initiatives. All approved by Daniel without board review, using his discretionary fund. A fund that existed only because my mother had insisted on it during the last restructuring, back when we were trying to save Daniel from his own poor judgment during the expansion into the Northeast markets. I clicked through invoice after invoice, watching the dollar amounts climb. Each one a small theft. Each one approved with Daniel's signature. Each one dated to correspond with a night he'd claimed to be working late, a weekend conference he'd attended alone, a business trip where he'd sent me photos of empty hotel rooms and claimed exhaustion. The Miami invoice made my hands still on the keyboard. 3 months ago, Daniel had gone to a finance conference in Miami. I'd stayed home because Emma had pneumonia, spending 3 days in the hospital holding our daughter's hand while she struggled to breathe through oxygen tubes. Daniel had sent photos from the conference, pictures of him alone in his hotel room, claiming he was too tired from presentations to join the evening events. Now, looking at this invoice, I saw a charge for 2 tickets to a restaurant called Nevera, dated the same night he'd sent me that photo. The receipt showed a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's monthly car payment. He'd been with her. While I held our daughter's hand in a sterile hospital room, while I managed his conference calls between breathing treatments, while I assured Emma that Daddy was thinking of her, he'd been with Sierra Taylor, drinking expensive wine and planning the future that would eventually cost me my career. Something inside me, something that had been bending for 7 years, finally snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was more like the quiet crack of ice on a frozen lake, the sound that comes right before everything falls through. I picked up my phone and called Caroline back. "Mrs. Clark," she answered immediately, her voice tight with anxiety. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to announce it like that. I thought you knew. I thought he'd at least told you." "Forward me everything," I said, my voice calm and precise. Every invoice from S. Taylor Associates for the past year. Every hotel receipt, every restaurant charge, every conference registration. I want it all, Caroline. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of her breathing as she calculated the cost of what I was asking. Mrs. Clark, I could lose my job. You won't, I promised, and I meant it. I guarantee you that. But I need this, Caroline. I need to see all of it. 20 minutes later, my inbox filled with documents. 6 months of systematic deception, laid out in PDFs and spreadsheets, each one timestamped and dated. Caroline had been meticulous, saving everything, perhaps knowing that someday someone would need this evidence. Perhaps knowing that the wife always finds out eventually. I printed everything, watching page after page emerge from my printer, the sound mechanical and soothing. Physical evidence felt more real than digital files, harder to deny, impossible to delete. I organized them chronologically, watching the timeline of Daniel's affair unfold like a story I should have seen coming. The first invoice was dated exactly 1 week after Daniel had told me we needed to postpone discussing my promotion because the board wasn't ready. He'd said they needed to see more evidence of my strategic thinking, more proof that I could handle the responsibility. Meanwhile, he'd been hiring Sierra Taylor, paying her $700,000 of company money for services I was already providing for free. I thought about calling my sister Margaret right then, or my mother, or my brother Thomas. The Whitmore family would rally around me, I knew that. But something held me back. This wasn't a moment for committee decisions or family councils. This was a moment that required the kind of cold, calculated response that my grandmother had been famous for in her day. The kind of move that people talked about in business schools as either brilliant or ruthless, depending on which side of it you were standing on. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet and began mapping out Meridian Holdings' financial structure. I'd helped build this architecture, after all. I knew every load-bearing wall, every foundation stone, every hidden support beam that kept the whole structure standing. And I knew exactly which ones to remove to make the entire thing collapse. The company's financial statements told a story that would have horrified any legitimate investor. Meridian Holdings was leveraged to the hilt, floating on credit lines that were guaranteed by what appeared to be diverse sources. In reality, every guarantee traced back to Whitmore money in one form or another. We were the invisible foundation holding up Daniel's glass tower, and he'd been so busy admiring his reflection in the windows that he'd forgotten to check what was holding him up. My phone rang. Emma's school. My daughter had forgotten her violin music, the same sheet music I'd been holding when Daniel destroyed my morning. The normalcy of the request felt surreal, like trying to have a conversation about groceries while watching a building burn down. But I gathered the music, put on real clothes for the first time that morning, and drove to Emma's school, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. The middle school building looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, before my world had cracked open. Teenagers still laughed in the hallways. Teachers still hurried between classrooms with armfuls of papers. The cafeteria still smelled like industrial pizza and teenage anxiety. Emma met me at the office, accepting the sheet music with a quick hug that made my eyes burn. "Thanks, Mom," she said, already turning back toward her classroom. "Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." I watched her disappear down the hallway, her violin case bumping against her leg, completely unaware that her father was systematically dismantling the family she thought was solid. How much longer could I protect her from this? How much longer should I try? The drive home took me past Meridian Holdings. The gleaming tower Daniel loved to photograph for his social media stood against the afternoon sky like a monument to ambition. Built from nothing, his LinkedIn bio claimed. I'd read it so many times I had it memorized. Visionary leader with proven track record of transforming startups into industry leaders. Not a single mention of the investors who'd made it possible. Not a word about the money that had saved him from bankruptcy 3 separate times. Just Daniel Clark, self-made man, building his empire through sheer force of genius. I pulled into the parking garage and sat in my car for a long moment, staring up at that tower. Somewhere in there, probably in the office that should have been mine, Sierra Taylor was settling into her new role. Maybe Daniel was showing her around, introducing her to people who'd known me for years. Maybe she was already planning the restructuring she'd implement, the fresh perspective she'd bring, the changes that would erase any trace of my contributions. The thought should have made me angry. Instead, it made me absolutely certain of what I needed to do next. I drove to Margaret's house without calling first. My sister took one look at my face and pulled me inside, already reaching for the wine. Margaret had always been the fierce one in our family, the one who'd become a judge specifically so she could have the power to make things right. She listened to my story with her judge's face on, the one that showed nothing but absorbed everything. "That bastard," she said when I finished, pacing her kitchen with volcanic energy. "That ungrateful, philandering piece of," she unleashed a string of expletives that would have made our mother faint. "I'll pull every cent our family has invested. Every single penny. Let's see how his little girlfriend handles a company with no funding." She was already reaching for her phone when I stopped her. "We need to call Mother first." Margaret paused, her finger hovering over the screen. We both knew what that meant. Eleanor Whitmore didn't do emotional reactions. She did strategic responses. She did calculated moves that people studied in business schools decades later. She did cold, precise justice that left no room for appeals or second chances. Mother answered on the second ring, as if she'd been expecting our call. Margaret put her on speaker, and I told the story again, more coherently this time, including the invoices, the hotels, the Miami conference during Emma's hospitalization. The silence that followed felt like judgment. "I see," Mother finally said, her tone arctic. "And you're just learning about this relationship now?" There were signs, I admitted, feeling 12 years old again. I chose not to see them. "Yes," she said simply. "You did." Her disappointment cut deeper than Daniel's betrayal. She had warned me in her way. All those careful questions about whether Daniel was treating me well. The observations about how tired I looked. The pointed comments about making sure I maintained control of my accounts. She had seen what I had refused to acknowledge, and now I had proved myself a failure in the one arena Whitmore women were supposed to excel in: protecting our assets. "A Whitmore woman doesn't crumble, dear," Mother continued, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "We strategize. Come to the estate tomorrow morning. Bring Margaret, and bring every financial document you have regarding Meridian Holdings. All of them, Lydia. I want to see exactly what we're working with." The line went dead. Margaret and I looked at each other across her kitchen table, the wine glasses between us suddenly seeming inadequate for what was coming. "She's going to help you destroy him," Margaret said, and it wasn't a question. "She's going to help me take back what's mine," I corrected. "There's a difference." That night, I cooked dinner as usual. Salmon with asparagus, Emma's favorite. She chatted about school while I nodded and smiled, my mind calculating withdrawal sequences, timing, impact. Daniel texted that he'd be late, another emergency meeting. I didn't bother responding. Emergency meeting with Sierra, most likely. Planning their future with my family's money. After Emma went to bed, I returned to my study and opened a new spreadsheet. 14 accounts, 58% of Meridian's operating capital. One by one, I began drafting withdrawal notices. Not to send yet, just to have ready. Each one carefully worded, legally bulletproof, timed for maximum impact. The photo on my desk caught my attention. Our wedding day, Daniel's hand on my waist, my father beside us, beaming with pride. Except now, looking closer, I realized his expression wasn't just joy. There was concern there too, worry lines around his eyes that I'd been too in love to notice 7 years ago. He'd pulled me aside that day, I remembered suddenly. "The Clarks are ambitious people," he'd said. "Make sure you protect yourself." I'd thought he was being old-fashioned, paranoid even. Now I understood he'd seen exactly what I'd been too blind to see. Daniel had never loved me for myself. He loved what I represented: access to the Whitmore fortune, entry into our family circles, the legitimacy that came with marrying into old money. I hadn't been his partner. I'd been his ticket. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it clarified everything. This wasn't about saving a marriage that had never really existed. This was about reclaiming my identity, my power, my family's legacy. This was about showing Emma that Whitmore women didn't accept betrayal gracefully. We responded to it strategically. I worked until 3 in the morning, crafting withdrawal notices that would dismantle Daniel's empire with surgical precision. The Singapore fund would go first, creating immediate cash flow problems. Then the Eleanor Trust, wiping out their expansion reserves. The Patriot Capital and Sterling Investments withdrawals would trigger debt covenant violations. By the time the remaining 10 accounts pulled out, Meridian Holdings would be technically insolvent. And Daniel would finally understand that the Emperor had never had any clothes. He'd just been borrowing mine. The invisible architecture. The Whitmore family estate sat on 12 acres in Connecticut's quiet countryside, far enough from the city to feel like another world, but close enough that Mother could attend her various board meetings without significant travel. The main house was Georgian colonial, built by my great-great-grandfather in 1887 with shipping money, expanded by each generation until it sprawled across the hilltop like a monument to accumulated wealth and carefully guarded secrets. I arrived at 8 in the morning, as Mother had instructed. Margaret's car was already in the circular driveway, along with Thomas's BMW and, surprisingly, our cousin Robert's Tesla. The family was gathering then. This wasn't just going to be a consultation with Mother. This was going to be a council of war. Mother's housekeeper, Mrs. Chin, who'd been with the family since before I was born, greeted me at the door with her usual warm efficiency. "They're in the library, Miss Lydia. Your mother asked me to bring coffee and pastries." The library was my favorite room in the house, a 2-story space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves holding 5 generations of family history. First editions, financial records, personal journals, legal documents. Everything the Whitmore family had ever done was archived here, including secrets that would make most families uncomfortable. Ours had always believed in documentation, in preserving the truth even when the truth wasn't flattering. Mother sat at the head of the massive oak table that dominated the center of the room, looking like a queen holding court. At 72, Eleanor Whitmore still had the kind of presence that made CEOs nervous. Her silver hair was pulled back in her signature chignon, her navy suit impeccable, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents spread before her. Margaret sat to her right, already deep in legal texts. Thomas occupied the left, his laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. Robert, our cousin who managed the family's real estate holdings, stood by the window with his phone, clearly already making calls. "Sit," Mother said without looking up, pointing to the chair across from her. I sat, placing my laptop bag on the table. The movement made everyone look up, and I saw my family's faces arrange themselves into expressions of concern and, unexpectedly, pride. They'd known this was coming, I realized. They'd all seen what I'd been too close to see. "I've pulled the partnership agreements from when Meridian was first structured," Mother said, sliding a manila folder across the table toward me. "Your father insisted on certain protections when we made our initial investment. Protections that Daniel signed without fully understanding what they meant." I opened the folder and began reading. The language was dense, legal terminology that required careful parsing, but the meaning became clear quickly. The Whitmore family's initial $8 million investment hadn't been a simple equity purchase. It had been structured as a convertible note with specific performance requirements and breach conditions. If Meridian Holdings failed to meet certain operational standards, if funds were misused, if there was any indication of fraud or malfeasance, the note could be converted into majority control of the company. "These clauses are still active?" I asked, my heart beating faster. "Every single one," Margaret confirmed, tapping her own legal pad where she'd been making notes. "I've checked. The conversion option expires in 2030. We're well within the window." "And the performance requirements?" I looked back at the document, reading the specific metrics listed. Quarterly reporting, board oversight, transparent use of funds. "All of which Daniel has been violating," Thomas interjected, turning his laptop so I could see the spreadsheet he'd built. "I've been tracking Meridian's financial reporting for the past 18 months. The inconsistencies are substantial. Money moving between accounts without proper documentation. Consulting fees that don't match market rates. Executive compensation that wasn't approved by the full board." Robert ended his phone call and joined us at the table. "I've been looking into the Connecticut property," he said. The one listed in Sierra Taylor's name. The down payment hasn't been made yet, but the funding source is listed as Meridian Holdings, specifically from Daniel's discretionary bonus pool. A bonus pool that was created using Whitmore money during the last restructuring. Mother removed her reading glasses and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, usually right before she made a business move that left other people scrambling. Tell me, Lydia. What do you want? It was the question I'd been asking myself since yesterday morning. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? My marriage back? Each option had rolled through my mind in the sleepless hours of the night, and I discarded them one by one until only the truth remained. I want Meridian, I said. Not to destroy it. To run it. Properly. The way it should have been run from the beginning. Mother smiled, the expression sharp and satisfied. Good. Sentiment is expensive. Pragmatism is profitable. She stood and moved to a wall safe hidden behind a bookshelf, the kind of safe that existed in old houses for old money. The combination was a date I recognized: my grandmother's birthday. Inside were documents going back decades, the paper yellowed with age, but the words still clear. She extracted a portfolio and brought it back to the table. Your grandmother faced something similar, Mother said, opening the portfolio carefully. 1952, your grandfather had partnered with a man named William Ashford to build a manufacturing company. Ashford began making decisions without consultation, began believing the company was his creation rather than a joint venture. He even attempted to buy out your grandmother's shares at a fraction of their value, thinking she wouldn't understand the finances. I'd heard stories about my grandmother, Helen Whitmore, but always in the context of her charity work and her skill at managing the household. Never this. What did she do? I asked. Mother smiled. She acquired his shares during the crisis that followed. Within 6 months, she owned 70% of the company. Within a year, Ashford was working as a regional manager in their smallest facility. He stayed there until retirement, a reminder to himself and everyone else about what happens when you underestimate a Whitmore woman. She slid the portfolio across to me. Inside were newspaper clippings from 1952, documenting the sudden restructuring of Ashford Manufacturing. Founder steps down amid financial irregularities, one headline read. New management promises transparency and growth, another proclaimed. There was a photo of my grandmother at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, looking serene and powerful, while in the background, barely visible, stood William Ashford with the expression of a man who'd just learned an expensive lesson. This is who you come from, Mother said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. Women who built empires while men took credit. Women who smiled at dinner parties and destroyed competitors before breakfast. Women who protected what was theirs with ruthless efficiency. Margaret pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her notes. I've contacted Jennifer Brennan at Brennan and Associates. They specialize in corporate litigation and hostile restructuring. She's willing to meet with you this afternoon. I've already started drafting the withdrawal notices, I said, opening my laptop. 14 accounts, staggered timing to maximize impact. No, Mother said sharply, and everyone at the table went still. You don't just withdraw, Lydia. That's what an angry spouse does. That's what someone does when they want to hurt their partner. You're not an angry spouse. You're a Whitmore family representative protecting a failed investment. The approach must be strategic, not emotional. She was right, of course. The difference wasn't just semantic. An emotional withdrawal would look like exactly what it was: a wife lashing out at a cheating husband. But a strategic withdrawal from a poorly managed company? That was just good business. That was the kind of move that protected us from legal challenges and positioned us for the next phase. We document everything first, Mother continued, already making a list on her own notepad. Evidence of misuse of funds. Evidence of the relationship affecting business decisions. Evidence of breach of fiduciary duty. Then we approach the board quietly, before the withdrawal. We give them a choice: rectify the situation or lose their funding. Either way, we maintain control of the narrative. Thomas nodded, his fingers already moving across his keyboard. I can have a full audit completed by tomorrow afternoon. We'll need access to Meridian's internal systems. Caroline, I said, and everyone looked at me. Daniel's assistant. She's been documenting everything. She gave me 6 months of invoices, but she'll have more. She has system access. Can she be trusted? Margaret asked, her lawyer's skepticism showing. I thought about Caroline's voice on the phone yesterday, the way she'd said, I can't watch this anymore. The tremor in her words when she'd forwarded those documents, knowing it could cost her the job she'd held for 5 years. Yes, I said. She can be trusted. Then we need her on our side officially, Mother said. Offer her a position with the family office. Better salary, better title, and most importantly, legal protection when this all comes out. She'll be our inside witness. Robert leaned forward, his business mind clearly already calculating. What about Daniel's board allies? Wallace sits on 3 boards with your mother, but what about the others? Brennan, the CFO, where does his loyalty sit? Richard Brennan is a numbers man, I said, remembering the times I'd worked with him on financial restructuring. He follows the money. If we can show him that Meridian's financial position is unstable without Whitmore backing, he'll support the change. He has too much personally invested to go down with Daniel's ship. Then we approach him first, Mother decided. Before we move on anything else, we secure the CFO's cooperation. Thomas, I want you to prepare a presentation showing Meridian's true financial position without Whitmore support. Make it clear, make it undeniable, make it terrifying. My phone buzzed. Daniel, asking where I was. I'd told him I was visiting Mother to discuss her birthday gala, a fiction he'd accepted without question because he never really paid attention to family obligations unless they involved networking opportunities. He's asking about me, I said, showing the text to Margaret. Tell him you'll be home for dinner, she said. We need you to maintain normalcy for the next 48 hours while we get everything in position. Can you do that? Can you sit across from him at dinner and pretend everything is fine? I thought about it, really considered whether I had that kind of control. Then I thought about the Miami invoice, about Emma in the hospital while Daniel drank expensive wine with his mistress, about nothing personal, delivered with such casual indifference. Yes, I said. I can do that. Mrs. Chin brought coffee and pastries then, and we spent the next 3 hours building a strategy that was part legal maneuvering, part financial pressure, and part psychological warfare. By the time I left the estate that afternoon, we had a timeline, a task list, and a clear objective, complete restructuring of Meridian Holdings with me at the helm, accomplished within 1 week. The drive back to the city gave me time to think about what Mother had said. Women who smiled at dinner parties and destroyed competitors before breakfast. Was that who I wanted to be? The kind of woman who maintained a pleasant facade while systematically dismantling someone's life? But then, Daniel had already made that choice for both of us. He'd smiled and kissed my cheek while planning to replace me with his mistress. He'd maintained his pleasant facade while spending my family's money on her consulting fees and future real estate. He destroyed our marriage while I stood there in my bathrobe, completely unaware that the betrayal had been underway for months. I wasn't choosing to become this person. I was choosing to stop pretending I wasn't. The evidence mounts. Caroline met me at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Meridian Holdings at 7 the next morning. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of carrying secrets that aren't yours to carry. Her usual impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled, her blouse wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail rather than her normal sleek bun. Thank you for meeting me, I said, sliding into the booth across from her. Mrs. Clark, I need you to know I never wanted to be part of this, she said immediately, her words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing them. When Mr. Clark first hired Sierra as a consultant, I thought it was legitimate. I swear I did. But then the invoices started coming through, and the expenses, and the hotel rooms, and I knew. I knew what was happening, but what was I supposed to do? He's my boss. He signs my paychecks. I have student loans and rent and... Caroline, I interrupted gently. I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to offer you a job. She stopped mid-sentence, her mouth actually falling open slightly. What? The Whitmore family office is looking for a senior executive assistant, I said, pulling out the offer letter Mother had drafted that morning by our family attorney. Better salary than what you're making now, full benefits, and most importantly, legal protection for any testimony you might need to provide regarding Meridian's financial practices. Caroline took the paper with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the numbers. I watched her face change as she processed what she was reading. The base salary was 40% higher than what Daniel paid her. The benefits package was comprehensive. The title was more prestigious. And the legal protection clause, drafted by Margaret specifically to protect whistleblowers, was ironclad. "You're serious," she said, looking up at me. "Completely. But I need your help, Caroline. I need everything. Not just the invoices you already gave me. I need access logs, email trails, meeting schedules, calendar entries, expense reports. Everything that documents the relationship between Daniel and Sierra, and everything that shows how company money was misused." She was already nodding before I finished speaking. "I have it all. I've been saving everything since March, just in case." I didn't know what I was saving it for, but I knew someone would need it eventually. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Why risk your job to document all of this?" Caroline looked down at her coffee, stirring it slowly even though she hadn't added anything to it. "My mother stayed with my father for 20 years while he cheated on her with his secretary. When she finally left, she had no proof, no documentation, nothing. He claimed she was unstable, that she was making things up. She lost everything in the divorce because she couldn't prove what everyone knew was true. I swore I'd never let that happen to another woman if I could help it." I felt something in my chest tighten. Caroline had been protecting me without me even knowing I needed protection. She'd been building a case for a day she hoped would never come but prepared for anyway. "When can you start?" I asked. "I'll submit my resignation to Mr. Clark today. 2 weeks' notice is standard, but—" "Submit it effective immediately," I said. "Cite personal reasons. Don't mention the new position until after everything is finalized. Can you do that?" She nodded, determination replacing the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'll email my resignation the moment I get back to the office." "And the documentation?" Caroline reached into her bag and pulled out a small external hard drive. "Everything's on here, organized by date and category. I've even included video files from when I used my phone to record meetings where Mr. Clark and Sierra were clearly more than professional." The hard drive sat on the table between us, a small black rectangle containing the complete destruction of my husband's career. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, really. Maybe 4 ounces. Amazing how light evidence could be when you were holding someone's downfall in your hand. "There's something else you should know," Caroline said, her voice dropping even though we were alone in our corner booth. "Mr. Clark has been talking to the board about a major restructuring. He's planning to announce it next month. The plan is to take Meridian Holdings public, which would dilute your family's investment significantly. He's been working with an investment bank on the IPO structure." My hand tightened around the hard drive. An IPO would change everything. It would convert our private equity holdings into public shares, reducing our control, making it nearly impossible to exercise the conversion clauses in our original investment documents. And if the IPO was successful, if Meridian went public while everyone still believed Daniel was the genius behind its success, he'd walk away with hundreds of millions while my family's contribution would be reduced to a footnote in the company's origin story. "When?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "The preliminary prospectus is scheduled to be filed in 6 weeks. The board vote to approve the IPO process is next month." 6 weeks. We had 6 weeks before Daniel could potentially lock us out of our own investment through a public offering that would rewrite history entirely. 6 weeks before he could take credit for building an empire with other people's money and face none of the consequences. "Thank you, Caroline," I said, meaning it more than she could possibly know. "You've done the right thing." After she left, I sat in that coffee shop booth for another 20 minutes, the hard drive in my pocket feeling heavier with each passing moment. An IPO. Daniel wasn't just replacing me and sleeping with his consultant. He was planning to steal my family's legacy entirely, to convert years of Whitmore investments into a public success story where he was the hero and we were just early investors who got lucky. The audacity of it was almost impressive. I called Thomas from the parking lot. The timeline just accelerated. We don't have a week. We have days. What happened? I told him about the IPO, about the board vote scheduled for next month, about how Daniel was planning to dilute our holdings and rewrite the company's history in one stroke. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him typing. That changes things. If he files the preliminary prospectus, we lose our leverage. The SEC review process would complicate any restructuring efforts. So we move now. We move now, he agreed. I'll call Mother and Margaret. Can you get to Brennan's office by noon? I'll be there. Jennifer Brennan's office was in a steel and glass tower in Manhattan's financial district, the kind of building where billion-dollar deals were negotiated over coffee and empires changed hands between lunch meetings. Her firm occupied 3 floors, and the reception area alone probably cost more than most people's houses, all modern art and uncomfortable-looking designer furniture that was meant to intimidate rather than welcome. Jennifer herself was the opposite of her office. She was in her mid-50s, with graying hair she made no effort to dye, wearing a suit that was expensive but practical, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd won more battles than she'd lost. She shook my hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, and her eyes assessed me with the kind of rapid evaluation that told me she'd already formed opinions about my case before I'd said a word. "Mrs. Clark," she said, gesturing to the conference room. "Or should I say, Ms. Whitmore? Lydia is fine." Thomas and Margaret were already there, along with Robert and, surprisingly, Mother herself. They'd laid out documents across the massive conference table like a timeline of betrayal, each piece of evidence carefully organized and labeled. Jennifer walked the length of the table slowly, picking up documents at random, reading, setting them down, moving to the next. She spent particular attention on Caroline's hard drive contents, which Thomas had already uploaded to a secure server and printed out in relevant sections. "This is substantial," she finally said. "More than substantial. This is airtight. You have documentary evidence of fund misuse, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of investment terms, and evidence of personal malfeasance affecting business decisions." She looked up at me. "The question is, what do you want to achieve? Because with this evidence, you could pursue multiple avenues. Civil suit for fraud, criminal charges for embezzlement, hostile takeover through your conversion clauses, or simply withdrawal of all funds and let the company collapse." "I want control," I said. "Complete control. I want Daniel out, Sierra Taylor terminated, and myself installed as CEO with full board support." "Ambitious," Jennifer said, but she was smiling. "Difficult, but not impossible. The key is timing and leverage. We need to approach the board before Daniel realizes what's happening. We need to present them with a choice that isn't really a choice at all: support the restructuring or watch the company fold." Margaret leaned forward. "What about Daniel's allies on the board? Wallace plays golf with our mother, but there are others who've benefited from Daniel's leadership." "Benefited from the appearance of Daniel's leadership," Mother corrected. "Funded entirely by Whitmore money. Once they understand the true financial picture, they'll make the pragmatic choice." Jennifer pulled out a legal pad and began sketching an organizational chart. "Here's how we do this. First, we need Richard Brennan, the CFO, completely on our side." "Thomas, you said you have the financial analysis ready." "Complete," Thomas confirmed. "I can show him exactly how much of Meridian's success is attributable to Whitmore capital versus organic growth. The picture isn't pretty. Without our investments, Meridian would have folded 3 times, during the 2019 expansion crisis, during the 2021 supply chain disruption, and last year during the market downturn." "Good. We approach Brennan first, tomorrow morning. Show him the numbers, show him the evidence of financial mismanagement, and make it clear that his job security depends on making the right choice." Jennifer made a note on her pad. "Next, we need to secure at least 3 board members before we make any formal moves. Wallace is obviously with us." "Who else?" "Patricia Hammond," Mother said. "She's been on the board since the beginning. She's been skeptical of Daniel's expansion plans for years, but she's been outvoted consistently." "And Marcus Chin," I added. "He's the board's risk assessment specialist." If we show him the true financial picture and the evidence of mismanagement, he'll see that keeping Daniel is the biggest risk of all. Jennifer nodded, making more notes. Patricia Hammond, Marcus Chin, and Wallace. That gives us 3 out of 7, assuming they all support the restructuring. We need 4 for a majority. Who's the 4th? We all looked at each other. The remaining 3 board members were Daniel's appointments, people he'd brought in specifically because they would support his vision. Convincing any of them would be difficult. Sarah Okonkwo, Margaret said slowly. She's the newest board member, appointed just last year. She's a tech entrepreneur, built her own company from nothing. She might be sympathetic to another woman being undermined by her male partner. It's worth trying, Jennifer agreed. But we need to be strategic about the approach. This can't look like a gender issue or a marital issue. This has to be about financial mismanagement and breach of contract. The personal elements are evidence, not motivation. She stood and walked to the whiteboard mounted on the wall, picking up a marker. Here's the timeline. Tomorrow morning, Thomas meets with Richard Brennan and presents the financial analysis. Tomorrow afternoon, Lydia and Eleanor meet with Patricia Hammond and Marcus Chin separately. Tomorrow evening, Margaret approaches Sarah Okonkwo, lawyer to lawyer, businesswoman to businesswoman. Jennifer began writing dates and times on the board, creating a minute-by-minute schedule. Friday morning, assuming we have 4 board members on our side, we call an emergency board meeting for Friday afternoon. We present the evidence, we make the proposal for restructuring, and we force a vote before Daniel has time to mount a defense. That's 3 days from now, I said. 3 days to completely restructure a company. 3 days to correct years of mismanagement, Mother corrected. 3 days to take back what's rightfully ours. Jennifer capped her marker and turned back to us. I need to be clear about something. This kind of move will be public. The business press will cover it. Your personal life will be scrutinized. The details of Daniel's affair, the evidence of financial mismanagement, all of it will come out. Are you prepared for that level of exposure? I thought about Emma, about how she would feel when her classmates' parents read about this in the Wall Street Journal. I thought about the country club gossip, the pitying looks, the whispered conversations that would stop when I entered rooms. I thought about Daniel's family, his mother who'd spent 7 years making subtle digs about my family's new money, seeing their son publicly humiliated. And then I thought about Sierra Taylor's hand on my husband's shoulder. About nothing personal delivered while he destroyed my career. About the house in Connecticut that he planned to buy with my grandmother's trust fund. About Emma asking if Sierra was going to be her new mommy soon. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. That evening, I maintained the fiction perfectly. I cooked dinner, Daniel's favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables, and set the table with the good china. When he came home at 7, I greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and asked about his day with genuine-seeming interest. Crazy day, he said, loosening his tie as he collapsed onto the sofa. The board is asking questions about next quarter's projections. They want more detailed breakdowns of our funding sources. I felt a cold satisfaction at that. Someone on the board was already getting nervous, already asking the right questions. What did you tell them? That we have diverse institutional backing and strong fundamentals. Same thing I always tell them. He reached for the remote, already half-focused on the evening news. How was your day? How's your mother's birthday planning going? Good. Mother has very specific ideas about what she wants. That was true, just not about her birthday. Emma's upstairs doing homework. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Daniel nodded absently, his attention already on his phone. I watched him scroll through messages, his face illuminated by the blue screen glow, and wondered if he was texting Sierra. Wondered if they were discussing their future house, their future life, their future that would never happen because I was about to pull the foundation out from under both of them. Emma came down for dinner with her laptop, wanting to show us her science project on renewable energy. She'd built a small solar panel array that could charge a phone, complete with efficiency calculations and environmental impact assessments. She was so proud of it, her face glowing with the enthusiasm that only 12-year-olds can fully access. Daniel barely looked at it. That's great, sweetie, he said, reaching for more vegetables. Very scientific. Dad, Look at the efficiency ratings, Emma insisted, turning the laptop toward him. I managed to get 32% conversion, which is actually really good for this size panel. Daniel said, checking his phone again. I watched Emma's face fall, watched her close the laptop slowly, watched her retreat into the careful neutrality that she'd been developing lately. The neutrality that children develop when they realize their parent isn't really present, isn't really interested, isn't really there at all even when they're sitting right across the table. Emma, this is incredible, I said, reaching for her laptop. Show me the calculations. How did you determine the optimal angle for the panels? She brightened immediately, launching into an explanation of sun tracking and seasonal variations, and I listened to every word while making mental notes. This was what Daniel was sacrificing. Not just our marriage, not just our partnership, but these moments with our daughter. These dinners where she shared her achievements and her excitement. These small, precious pieces of her childhood that he was throwing away for a woman young enough to be his daughter's older sister. After Emma went to bed, Daniel poured himself a scotch and suggested we watch a movie. I sat beside him on the sofa, his arm around my shoulders, watching some action thriller he'd chosen without asking if I wanted to see it. His phone buzzed every 10 minutes, and each time he checked it, I could see Sierra's name reflected in his glasses. Everything okay? I asked during one particularly long texting session. Just work stuff, he said, not even creative enough to come up with a better lie. Crisis with the Asian expansion. Might need to fly to Singapore next month. Singapore, where the growth fund was supposedly managed by independent investors. Where Daniel had supposedly negotiated brilliant deals with international financiers. In reality, where my mother's former business school roommate managed one of our family trusts from an office overlooking Marina Bay. That sounds important, I said, keeping my voice sympathetic. Will Sierra need to go with you? For the strategic planning? He actually flinched at that, just slightly, before recovering. Maybe. We haven't decided yet. I let it drop, not because I cared about his answer, but because I wanted him comfortable, unsuspecting. I wanted these last few days before everything exploded to be normal, to give him no warning about what was coming. Let him think he'd gotten away with it. Let him think his plan was working perfectly. When we went to bed, he kissed me goodnight, the gesture perfunctory and tired. I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow, Thomas would show Richard Brennan the truth about Meridian's finances. Tomorrow, Mother and I would sit down with board members and show them evidence they couldn't ignore. Tomorrow, we would start the countdown to Friday's emergency board meeting. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed fiction of Daniel Clark's genius would begin to crumble. The board members. Richard Brennan's office at Meridian Holdings was exactly what you'd expect from a CFO, organized, sparse, and dominated by multiple monitors displaying real-time financial data. When Thomas and I arrived at 8:30 Wednesday morning, Richard was already there, reviewing spreadsheets with the intensity of someone who'd been working for hours. Mrs. Clark, Thomas, he said, standing to greet us. There was wariness in his eyes, but also curiosity. Your message said this was urgent. It is, Thomas said, moving directly to Richard's desk and plugging his laptop into the monitor array. We need to show you something. Something that will change how you understand this company's financial position. The first slide was simple: Meridian Holdings' 5-year revenue chart. Steady growth, impressive returns, the kind of trajectory that made investors excited and boards happy. Richard had seen this chart 1,000 times. He'd probably created variations of it himself. Now watch, Thomas said, and clicked to the next slide. The same chart appeared, but this time with overlay bars showing Whitmore family investments. Every time Meridian had experienced a growth spike, there was a corresponding Whitmore investment. Every time the company had weathered a market crisis, there was Whitmore money filling the gap. The correlation was perfect, undeniable, and devastating. Every major milestone, Thomas said, his voice clinical and precise, corresponds with an infusion of Whitmore capital. The 2019 expansion that Daniel credits with establishing Meridian's market leadership, $8 million from the Singapore Growth Fund. The 2021 supply chain crisis that Daniel supposedly solved with brilliant logistics partnerships? $12 million from Eleanor Holdings that restructured our debt and extended our credit lines. Last year's market downturn that Daniel navigated with what the board called visionary leadership? $6 million from the Patriot Capital Emergency Fund. Richard was leaning forward now, his eyes moving between the monitors, his fingers unconsciously reaching for his own keyboard as if to verify the numbers independently. "You're saying all of Meridian's success is attributable to Whitmore money," Richard said slowly. "Not all," I interjected. "The company has legitimate operations, real clients, actual value. But the growth trajectory, the ability to weather crises, the expansion into new markets, all of that has been funded primarily by my family's investments disguised as diverse institutional backing." Thomas clicked to another slide. This one showed Meridian's current financial position, stripped of Whitmore backing. The picture was grim. Debt that had seemed manageable with guaranteed Whitmore credit lines became crushing without them. Expansion plans that had seemed ambitious became impossibly risky. Growth projections that had looked solid became speculative at best. "Without Whitmore money," Thomas said, "Meridian Holdings is technically insolvent. The company is leveraged at a ratio that no legitimate lender would support without the backing we've been providing. If my family withdraws support, you're looking at bankruptcy within 60 days. Richard's face had gone pale. "Daniel knows about this?" "He knows the true source of these investments." I opened my laptop and pulled up the documents Caroline had provided. Every major investment came with disclosure documents. Daniel signed acknowledgments identifying Whitmore Trust as the cornerstone investor. He personally negotiated terms with Eleanor Holdings, which is literally named after my mother. He knew Richard. He's always known. Then why would he? Richard stopped, understanding dawning across his face. "The IPO. He's planning to take the company public to dilute your holdings. And to rewrite the company's origin story," Thomas added. "The preliminary prospectus that's being drafted describes Meridian as Daniel Clark's vision, built through his leadership and strategic partnerships. The Whitmore family gets mentioned as early investors who participated in the journey, but the narrative credits Daniel with everything." Richard sat back in his chair, and I watched him process the implications. He was a numbers man, and the numbers were telling him that everything he'd believed about Meridian Holdings was a carefully constructed fiction. More than that, they were telling him that his own career success, his stock options, his reputation, everything was built on a foundation that could disappear overnight. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "The truth," I said simply. "I want you to present the real financial picture to the board. I want you to explain how Meridian actually operates, where the money really comes from, and what will happen if that funding source disappears." "You're planning to withdraw," Richard said. It wasn't a question. "I'm planning to restructure," I corrected. "Daniel resigns, Sierra Taylor is terminated, and proper governance is restored with full transparency about funding sources. In exchange, the Whitmore family continues its support and actively helps stabilize the company during the transition." "And if the board doesn't agree?" Thomas closed his laptop with a decisive click. "Then we withdraw every cent, file breach of contract suits for Daniel's misuse of funds, and let Meridian Holdings fail. We'll recover what we can through bankruptcy proceedings, and you'll be looking for a new job by Monday." The threat was clear and backed by undeniable financial reality. Richard could support the restructuring and keep his job, his stock options, and his professional reputation. Or he could stand with Daniel and watch everything collapse. "There's something else you should know," Richard said after a long moment of silence. "Sierra Taylor's consulting contract contains performance bonuses tied to successful implementation of her strategic recommendations. If the board approves her appointment to Chief Strategy Officer, she's entitled to a bonus of $2 million, payable immediately." $2 million. For 6 months of sleeping with my husband and stealing my promotion. "That bonus is funded from Daniel's discretionary pool?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Which is funded entirely by Whitmore Investments," Richard confirmed. "He's essentially using your family's money to pay his mistress millions of dollars." Thomas was already pulling up contracts on his tablet. "That's actionable fraud." We can use that in the breach of contract suit if needed. Richard stood and moved to his window, looking out over the city. I've been CFO here for 6 years, he said quietly. I've watched Daniel take credit for financial engineering that I implemented, for deals that your family funded, for strategic decisions that came from a dozen other people. I told myself it didn't matter because we were all benefiting, because the company was successful, because that's how corporate leadership works. But this is different. This is theft disguised as strategy. He turned back to us. I'll present the real numbers to the board. I'll support the restructuring. But I have one condition. What? I asked. I want to stay on as CFO. I want to be part of building something legitimate, something real. I'm tired of cooking books to make Daniel look brilliant. I'd been prepared to fire Richard along with Daniel, to clean house entirely. But looking at him now, seeing the exhaustion and frustration in his face, I realized he'd been trapped too. Not in the same way as me, not with the same personal betrayal, but trapped nonetheless in a system where the truth had to be bent to serve someone else's ego. If you support this restructuring completely, if you present the honest financial picture to the board, then yes, I said. You can stay. But everything changes, Richard. No more creative accounting, no more making Daniel look good, no more hiding the truth about where our success comes from. That's all I want, he said. To do the job honestly for once. We left Richard's office with one crucial ally secured. The CFO would present the real financial picture at the emergency board meeting, and his testimony would carry weight precisely because he'd been complicit in the fiction for so long. His willingness to tell the truth now would make the truth impossible to dismiss. That afternoon, Mother and I sat in Patricia Hammond's stunning penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. Patricia was 71, a retired CEO herself who'd been on Meridian's board since the company's incorporation. She'd made her fortune in pharmaceutical distribution, and she had a reputation for asking difficult questions that made other board members uncomfortable. Eleanor, she greeted Mother with a warm hug, then turned to me with concern in her eyes. Lydia, I've been worried about you. I heard Daniel's announcement about Sierra Taylor's appointment, and I voted against it. So did Marcus. But we were outvoted. I know, I said. And I'm grateful. But the appointment is the least of our problems, Patricia. We spent the next hour walking Patricia through the evidence. The funding sources that were all Whitmore money. The invoices for Sierra's consulting fees. The proof of Daniel's relationship affecting business decisions. The planned IPO that would dilute our family's holdings and rewrite company history. Patricia listened with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms where people lied with expensive smiles and carefully crafted presentations. When we finished, she was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea and looking out at Central Park. I knew something was wrong, she finally said. The numbers never quite added up. The timing of our capital infusions always seemed too convenient, too perfect. But I assumed Daniel had connections I didn't know about, that he was leveraging relationships from his previous positions. She laughed bitterly. I never imagined he was just spending his wife's money while pretending to be a genius. Will you support a restructuring? Mother asked directly. Emergency board meeting, Friday afternoon. Vote to remove Daniel and install Lydia as CEO. Patricia didn't hesitate. Absolutely. It's the right thing to do ethically, and it's the smart thing to do financially. Without your family's support, Meridian is worthless. Better to have honest leadership than a charismatic liar. 2 board members secured. Marcus Chin was harder to convince, not because he doubted the evidence, but because he had to work through the implications carefully. Marcus was a risk assessment specialist, and his entire professional identity was built on evaluating threats and opportunities with cold, mathematical precision. We met him at his office downtown, a space filled with whiteboards covered in probability calculations and risk matrices. Show me the worst-case scenario, he said immediately after we'd presented the basic facts. Not the emotional story, not the personal betrayal. Show me the mathematical worst case if Whitmore money disappears. Thomas pulled up his most devastating projection. Meridian Holdings, stripped of Whitmore backing, facing immediate debt covenant violations, credit line withdrawals, and cash flow crisis. The probability of bankruptcy within 60 days, 87%. The probability of successful restructuring without Whitmore support, less than 5%. And the best-case scenario with Whitmore support continuing under new leadership? Marcus asked. Thomas showed him the alternative projection. Transparent funding structure, proper governance, realistic growth targets. Probability of continued profitability, 92%. Probability of successful long-term viability, 85%. Marcus studied the numbers for a long time, occasionally asking Thomas to break down specific calculations or assumptions. Finally, he looked up at me. "I need to know you're capable of running this company," he said bluntly. "Not because I doubt women's leadership abilities, but because being married to a CEO is different from being a CEO yourself. The skills are different. The pressures are different. Can you actually do this job?" It was a fair question, and I'd been expecting it. I pulled out my tablet and opened a presentation I'd been preparing for months, long before Daniel's betrayal, back when I'd still thought the Chief Strategy Officer position would be mine. "This is my strategic plan for Meridian's next 3 years," I said, handing him the tablet. Revenue diversification, operational efficiency improvements, market expansion into sectors where we're currently underperforming, and restructuring of our debt to reduce interest expenses by 30%. Marcus read through it carefully, his fingers occasionally zooming in on specific sections or scrolling back to reread something. The plan was solid because I'd been living and breathing Meridian's operations for 7 years. I knew the company's strengths and weaknesses better than Daniel did because I'd been the one actually managing the financial architecture while he'd been taking credit and planning his exit. "This is good," Marcus said finally. "Better than good. This is the kind of strategic thinking we've needed for years." Daniel's plans were always focused on growth for growth's sake, expansion without considering operational capacity. "This is sustainable. Then you'll support the restructuring?" He nodded slowly. "I'll support it. But I want to be part of the leadership transition. I want to chair a special board committee overseeing the change, making sure it's done properly. Can you accept that level of oversight?" "I'd prefer it," I said honestly. "I want this to be legitimate, Marcus. I want proper governance and real transparency. The oversight helps us achieve that." 3 board members secured. That evening, Margaret met with Sarah Okonkwo at a women's networking event downtown. Sarah was the newest board member, appointed just last year after selling her tech startup for $200 million. She was 38, brilliant, and known for speaking her mind even when it made people uncomfortable. Margaret called me at 9 that night. "She's in," Margaret said without preamble. She actually said, and I quote, "It's about damn time someone called out Daniel's bullshit." Apparently, she's been fighting with him for months about strategic decisions, and he's been dismissing her input while praising Sierra's identical suggestions. For board members secured. We had our majority. "Friday afternoon," I said. "Emergency board meeting. This is really happening. Are you ready?" Margaret asked. I thought about the question. Was I ready to destroy my husband's career? To become CEO of a company that might fail despite my best efforts? To subject Emma and myself to public scrutiny and media attention? To fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't fully predict? "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." That night, I lay awake next to Daniel while he snored peacefully, completely unaware that his empire was being dismantled by the woman he'd relegated to supportive spouse. His phone sat on the nightstand, occasionally lighting up with messages from Sierra that he'd responded to before bed. At dinner, he'd mentioned the IPO again, talking about how it would secure all of our futures, completely oblivious to the irony that the future he was planning would never arrive. I thought about waking him, about telling him what was coming, about giving him one last chance to make things right. But what would that accomplish? He'd made his choices. He decided that Sierra was worth more than our marriage, that his ego was worth more than honesty, that his public image was worth more than integrity. Now he would face the consequences of those choices. Friday morning, I woke up early and went for a run through our neighborhood as the sun rose. The familiar streets felt different somehow, as if I was seeing them for the first time. Or perhaps seeing them for the last time as the person I'd been. By this evening, I would be either the CEO of Meridian Holdings or the woman who destroyed her husband's company out of spite, depending on who was telling the story. I hoped it would be the former, but I was prepared for either outcome. When I returned home, Daniel was already up, getting ready for what he thought would be a normal Friday at the office. He was whistling in the shower, actually whistling, and I listened to the sound while pouring my coffee. The last morning of his old life, and he didn't even know it. "Big day today?" I asked when he came downstairs, already straightening his tie in that familiar gesture. "Just the usual. Some meetings, some strategic planning with Sierra." He kissed my cheek. "Don't wait up tonight. We might grab dinner after work to discuss the Asian expansion." Dinner with Sierra. On the night of the emergency board meeting that would end both of their positions at Meridian. The universe had a sense of humor, apparently. "Have a good day," I said, smiling. "You too, babe." After he left, I dressed carefully for the board meeting. Not the burgundy gown Daniel preferred for galas, not the soft pastels that suggested supportive wife. I chose a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, with a crisp white blouse. Professional, serious, powerful. The outfit of a CEO, not a spouse. Emma found me in my closet, putting on my grandmother's pearl earrings. "You look fancy, Mom," she said. "Do you have something important today?" "Very important, sweetheart." I turned to face her, this girl who was about to see her family explode in public. "Emma, I need you to know something. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear people say, I love you more than anything in the world. And everything I'm doing today, I'm doing to protect our future." She looked at me with those too perceptive 12-year-old eyes. "Is this about Dad and Sierra?" "It's about a lot of things. But yes, partly." Emma hugged me then, her arms tight around my waist. "Good," she whispered. "She's mean, Mom. She talks to everyone like they're stupid. You're way better." Out of the mouths of children, as they say. At 2 o'clock Friday afternoon, I walked into Meridian Holdings for the emergency board meeting that would change everything. The building looked the same as always, gleaming glass and steel, the monument to ambition that Daniel loved so much. But it felt different now, knowing that in a few hours, it would either be mine to run or a ruin we'd left behind. The boardroom was on the executive floor, all windows and expensive furniture. Board members were already arriving, taking their seats, exchanging greetings with the careful neutrality of people who knew something significant was about to happen, but didn't know what. Wallace, the board chairman and my mother's golf partner, sat at the head of the table. Patricia Hammond took the seat to his right. Marcus Chin sat across from her, already pulling out his tablet and risk assessment notes. Sarah Okonkwo arrived last, her energy filling the room as she greeted everyone with her characteristic direct friendliness. Daniel's 3 board allies, Jonathan Price, Michael Torres, and Catherine Vance, sat together on the opposite side, clearly confused about why an emergency meeting had been called without Daniel's knowledge. They kept checking their phones, probably trying to reach him, but he wasn't answering because he was in a strategic planning session with Sierra, completely unaware that his career was ending. Richard Brennan sat at the small desk where the CFO traditionally presented financial updates, his laptop connected to the large screen. He looked nervous but determined, occasionally glancing at me with something that might have been apology or solidarity. It was hard to tell. At 2:15, Wallace called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd chaired hundreds of board meetings. "We have a serious matter to address regarding the financial governance of Meridian Holdings. Before we begin, I need to note for the record that Mr. Clark was notified of this meeting but chose not to attend." That was a lie, of course. Daniel hadn't been notified, but Wallace saying he had been created a paper trail that protected the board legally. It suggested Daniel had been given opportunity to defend himself and had declined, rather than the truth, that we deliberately excluded him to prevent him from mounting a defense. "Richard," Wallace continued, "please present your financial analysis." Richard stood, and the screen behind him lit up with the first slide. Meridian Holdings' 5-year revenue chart, the same one Thomas had shown Richard 3 days ago. The familiar story of steady growth and impressive returns. Then Richard clicked to the next slide, and everything changed. The Whitmore family overlay appeared, showing the direct correlation between our investments and every major company milestone. The room went absolutely silent as board members processed what they were seeing. Even Daniel's allies leaned forward, their confusion evident. "What you're looking at," Richard said, his voice steady despite his obvious nerves, "is the true source of Meridian Holdings' success. Every major growth initiative, every market expansion, every crisis that we've successfully navigated has been funded primarily by Whitmore family investments that were structured to appear as diverse institutional backing." He clicked through slide after slide, each one more damning than the last. The Singapore Growth Fund revealed as Whitmore Money. The Eleanor Trust, literally named after my mother. Patriot Capital and Sterling Investments, both family entities. 14 separate accounts, all of them ours, totaling 58% of the company's operational capital. "This is preposterous," Jonathan Price interrupted. "Daniel built this company from nothing. We all know that. Did we?" Richard asked, and there was an edge to his voice now. Or did we choose to believe that because it was a more comfortable story? He pulled up the next slide, showing Meridian's financial position stripped of Whitmore support. The numbers were stark and terrifying. Debt ratios that no legitimate lender would support. Credit lines that existed only because of Whitmore guarantees. Expansion plans funded entirely by capital that could disappear overnight. "Without Whitmore backing," Richard said, "Meridian Holdings is technically insolvent. We would face bankruptcy within 60 days. Catherine Vance, who'd been on the board for 4 years, actually gasped. "That can't be right. We have diverse funding sources," Daniel always said. "Daniel lied," I said, standing from my seat for the first time. "Or rather, he allowed all of you to believe a fiction because it served his interests." I moved to the front of the room, opening my own laptop and connecting it to the screen. Caroline's evidence appeared, organized and damning. Invoices showing $700,000 paid to Sierra Taylor's consulting firm. Hotel receipts and restaurant charges documenting their relationship. Email threads between Daniel and Sierra discussing their future together. "While running Meridian with my family's money," I said, my voice clear and firm, "my husband has been conducting an affair with a consultant he hired using company funds. He's been using the discretionary fund, which was created with Whitmore Capital, to pay his mistress hundreds of thousands of dollars for services that appear to consist primarily of sleeping with him and agreeing with his decisions." Michael Torres looked genuinely shocked. "Mrs. Clark, this is a serious accusation." "Which is why I have evidence." I pulled up the Miami conference receipts, the ones showing dinner for 2 while Emma was hospitalized with pneumonia. While I was at the hospital with our daughter, Daniel was in Miami with Sierra, billing expensive dinners and hotel rooms to company accounts. I showed them the Connecticut property listing, the one in Sierra's name with financing from Daniel's bonus pool. He's planning to buy his mistress a house using money from a bonus pool that was funded by my family's investments during the last restructuring. The room erupted with overlapping questions and exclamations. I let them process. Let the shock and disbelief wash over them. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when the carefully constructed fiction of Daniel Clark's genius would shatter completely. Wallace banged his gavel, calling for order. "Let Mrs. Clark finish." I pulled up the final piece of evidence. "There's one more thing you should know. Daniel is planning an IPO for next month. The preliminary prospectus is already being drafted. The purpose isn't to raise capital for growth. The purpose is to dilute Whitmore Holdings and rewrite the company's history before my family realizes what's happening." I showed them excerpts from the draft prospectus Caroline had found. Page after page describing Daniel's visionary leadership, his strategic brilliance, his ability to secure institutional funding from diverse sources. The Whitmore family was mentioned exactly once, in a footnote listing early investors. "If this IPO proceeds," I said, "Daniel will walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars built on my family's money while we're reduced to a footnote. He'll be celebrated as a self-made genius while the truth is buried in legal disclaimers." Sarah Okonkwo was the first to speak after the silence that followed. "This is fraud. Clear, documented, prosecutable fraud. Worse than fraud, Patricia Hammond added, her voice sharp with anger. This is systematic deception of the board, misappropriation of company funds, and breach of fiduciary duty on multiple levels. Jonathan Price was still shaking his head, looking between the evidence and the empty chair where Daniel should have been sitting. There has to be an explanation. Daniel wouldn't. Daniel would, and Daniel did, Marcus Chin interrupted, his risk assessment instincts clearly overwhelmed by the mathematical certainty of what we were showing them. The numbers don't lie, Jonathan. Meridian Holdings exists because of Whitmore money. Without it, we're bankrupt. That's not opinion. That's mathematical fact. So, what are you proposing? Catherine Vance asked, and I could see her already calculating her own liability in all of this. She'd been part of approving some of those consulting payments, after all. Restructuring, I said simply. Immediate and complete. Daniel resigns effective today. Sierra Taylor's consulting contract is terminated and her bonuses voided. I assume the position of CEO with full board support and oversight. In exchange, the Whitmore family continues its investment and actively works to stabilize and grow the company under transparent governance. And if we don't agree? Michael Torres asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mother spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of 72 years of making people understand their options. Then the Whitmore family withdraws all funding immediately, files breach of contract suits for misuse of our investments, and pursues criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Meridian Holdings declares bankruptcy by Monday, and every person in this room explains to their other boards why they failed to catch systematic financial mismanagement. The threat hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an ultimatum backed by evidence, money, and legal firepower they couldn't match. I need to call my lawyer, Jonathan Price said, reaching for his phone. You can call anyone you want, Jennifer Brennan said, speaking from her position along the wall where she'd been standing quietly. I'm Ms. Whitmore's counsel, and I can assure you that every action we're taking today is legally bulletproof. But if you need independent legal advice before voting, we can reconvene in 1 hour. 1 hour, Wallace agreed. We'll vote at 4 o'clock. The room cleared except for Mother, Margaret, Thomas, Robert, Jennifer, and me. We moved to Wallace's private office, a smaller space connected to the boardroom where we could wait without being in the same room as Daniel's allies. That went well, Margaret said, pouring water from the sideboard. Jonathan and Michael will fall in line once their lawyers explain they have no choice. Catherine is already mentally composing her resignation from other boards to minimize her liability. They'll vote for the restructuring, Jennifer confirmed. They have to. The alternative is professional suicide. My phone buzzed. Daniel, finally. 7 missed calls and a stream of increasingly frantic texts. Where are you? Asterisk emergency board meeting? What's going on, asterisk? Lydia, call me now. What the fuck is happening? Why is Caroline saying she resigned? I didn't respond. Let him panic. Let him feel for 1 hour what it was like when your entire world was being dismantled while you sat helpless and unaware. At 3:45, we returned to the boardroom. All 7 board members were in their seats, along with their various lawyers who'd clearly spent the last hour explaining that the evidence was undeniable and the choice was simple: support the restructuring or go down with Daniel. Wallace called the meeting back to order at precisely 4 o'clock. We have a proposal before the board, he said formally. Immediate restructuring of Meridian Holdings executive leadership. Mr. Daniel Clark to resign as CEO effective immediately, Ms. Sierra Taylor's consulting contract to be terminated, and Mrs. Lydia Whitmore Clark to assume the position of CEO subject to board oversight. All in favor? Wallace's hand went up immediately. Patricia Hammond. Marcus Chin. Sarah Okonkwo. For votes. There was a pause, and then Jonathan Price raised his hand slowly, followed by Catherine Vance. 6 votes. Everyone looked at Michael Torres, the last holdout, Daniel's closest ally on the board. This is going to destroy him, Michael said quietly. He destroyed himself, I replied. I'm just holding him accountable. Michael looked at me for a long moment, then raised his hand. 7-0. The motion passes. It was done. Just like that, with 7 hands in the air and the quiet acknowledgement that truth couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Daniel Clark was no longer CEO of Meridian Holdings. I was. "I'll draft the press release," Richard Brennan said, already typing on his laptop. "We'll frame this as a strategic restructuring with founding family taking direct operational control. That protects the company's reputation while acknowledging the change in leadership." "And Daniel?" Catherine asked. "What happens to him?" "He's being notified now," Jennifer said, checking her own phone. "Legal counsel is at his office delivering the news along with the evidence and his resignation papers. He can sign voluntarily or we file the breach of contract suit and criminal fraud charges tomorrow morning." I thought about Daniel sitting in his office, probably with Sierra, getting this news from lawyers instead of from me. Part of me felt guilty about that, the part that had loved him once. But the larger part, the part that had spent 3 days systematically dismantling his empire while sleeping in his bed, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "What about Sierra Taylor?" Sarah Okonkwo asked. "Just terminating her contract seems insufficient given the evidence of misappropriation. We're voiding her consulting fees and bonus provisions," Margaret said. "We'll offer her a settlement to sign an NDA and avoid legal action. She's complicit, but Daniel was the one with fiduciary duty to the company. We focus our legal resources on him if he doesn't resign quietly." My phone rang. Daniel again. I let it go to voicemail. "You should talk to him," Mother said quietly. "Not for his sake. For yours. This needs to end cleanly." She was right, of course. Avoiding him forever wasn't an option, not with Emma to consider, not with the divorce proceedings that would inevitably follow. But I didn't have to talk to him today, right now, in the immediate aftermath of destroying his career. "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll talk to him tomorrow." The board meeting concluded with logistics. Richard would handle the press release. Marcus would chair the oversight committee monitoring the transition. Sarah would work with me on strategic planning. Patricia would manage investor relations. Everyone had a role in making sure the restructuring succeeded rather than destroyed the company entirely. As we filed out of the boardroom, Wallace pulled me aside. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. "Helen was a force of nature, and you're proving you're cut from the same cloth." "I just want to run the company properly," I said. "No more lies, no more fiction. Just honest business." "That's all any of us should want," he replied. "But few have the courage to demand it when demanding it costs them personally." I left Meridian Holdings at 6 o'clock as CEO rather than the CEO's wife. The same building, the same elevator, the same lobby. But everything was different. The security guard who'd always nodded politely now greeted me with "Good evening." Ms. Whitmore, the receptionist who'd been cool and distant, suddenly wanted to know if I needed anything. The building itself seemed to recognize that power had shifted. My phone had 17 missed calls from Daniel and 3 voicemails I didn't listen to. Margaret texted, "He's in his office with lawyers." Sierra left crying an hour ago. Caroline says he's in shock. Good. Shock was appropriate. Shock meant he was finally understanding what he'd lost. I drove to pick up Emma from her friend's house where she'd been having dinner. Normal Friday evening activities, except nothing was normal anymore, and everything was about to change. "How was your important thing?" Emma asked, climbing into the car with her overnight bag. "Complicated," I said honestly. "But necessary. Are you hungry? Want to grab pizza?" "Mom, are you and Dad getting divorced?" The question came out of nowhere, or rather, from the place where 12-year-olds store all the observations they make but don't mention. Emma had been watching, seeing, understanding more than I'd given her credit for. "Probably," I said, because lying to her would be worse than the truth. "Dad made some choices that I can't accept. And I made some choices today that he's going to be very angry about. So yes, sweetheart, we're probably getting divorced." "Because of Sierra?" "Partly. But also because your dad and I stopped being partners a long time ago, and I finally stopped pretending otherwise." Emma was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. "My friend Melissa's parents got divorced last year. She said it was bad at first, but then it got better because they stopped fighting all the time. That's probably true for us too. Can I still see Dad?" "Of course. Always. Whatever happens between your dad and me, he's still your father and he loves you." That part, at least, I believed. Daniel had been a terrible husband and a dishonest businessman, but he'd never been deliberately cruel to Emma. Neglectful sometimes, distracted often, but not cruel. We got pizza and ate it at home, sitting on the couch watching some animated movie Emma had seen a dozen times. Normal Friday evening, except my phone kept buzzing with calls from Daniel that I kept ignoring, and every few minutes Emma would look at me with concern that she was trying hard to hide. At 9 o'clock, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. "Go to your room, sweetheart," I told Emma. "Your dad and I need to talk." She went without arguing, but slowly, clearly wanting to stay and hear whatever was about to happen. I waited until I heard her door close before I opened the front door. Daniel stood on our front porch looking like he'd aged 10 years in 6 hours. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his eyes red either from anger or crying or both. "How could you?" he said, his voice raw. "How could you do this to me?" "Come inside," I said. "We're not having this conversation where the neighbors can hear." He followed me into the living room but stayed standing, too agitated to sit. "You destroyed me. You destroyed everything I built." "I took back what was mine," I corrected. "Everything you built was built with my family's money, Daniel. You knew that. You've always known that." "That's not true. I made Meridian successful." "You borrowed money and took credit," I interrupted. "Every major success traces back to Whitmore Capital. Richard showed the board the real numbers today. Without our investments, Meridian would have failed 3 separate times." Daniel was shaking his head, denial warring with understanding. "This is about Sierra. You're doing this because of Sierra. This is about you systematically lying to everyone, including me, for years. Sierra is just the most recent betrayal in a long line of them." "I was going to tell you about her," he said, and I actually laughed at that. "When? After the IPO? After you'd diluted my family's holdings and bought her a house with my grandmother's trust fund money? Exactly when were you planning to tell me?" "It's not like that. It's exactly like that. I have the invoices, Daniel. I have the hotel receipts. I have emails where you and Sierra discuss your future together. I have evidence of you spending $700,000 in company money on your mistress while telling me I wasn't qualified for a promotion." He collapsed onto the sofa then, his head in his hands. "What do you want? You already destroyed my career. You already took the company. What else do you want?" "I want a divorce," I said simply. "Fast, quiet, and as amicable as we can make it for Emma's sake. You sign the papers without fighting, you don't contest custody, and in exchange, I don't file the fraud charges." His head snapped up. "You can't prove fraud. Jennifer Brennan thinks we can. The evidence of you using company money for personal benefits is substantial. The relationship with Sierra creates a clear conflict of interest. The bonus pool you used to fund her house was created with Whitmore money. It's textbook fraud, Daniel." "I'll fight this," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "And you'll lose. You'll lose in court, you'll lose in the press, and you'll lose any chance of working in this industry again. Or you can sign the divorce papers, accept a reasonable settlement, maintain a relationship with Emma, and move on with your life." "Reasonable settlement? You're taking everything." "I'm taking the company, yes. You'll keep the house until it sells, you'll get half of our joint assets excluding Whitmore family investments, and you'll have standard visitation with Emma. Given what you've done, that's more than reasonable." We sat in silence for a long moment. I watched him process his options, watched him realize that fighting would only make things worse, watched him accept that the empire he'd built on borrowed money was never really his to begin with. "I loved you," he said finally, and his voice cracked. "I did love you, Lydia. Maybe not in the right way, but I did." "I know," I said, and meant it. "But love isn't enough when it comes with lies and betrayal. It's just not enough." He left 20 minutes later, driving away from the house that would soon be sold, the marriage that was ending, the life that he'd thrown away for a 23-year-old consultant, and an ego that couldn't handle not being seen as a genius. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, feeling something release in my chest that I didn't even know I'd been holding. Relief, maybe? Or just exhaustion. The battle was over. The restructuring was done. Daniel was gone. Now came the hard part. actually running the company I'd fought so hard to control. 6 months later. The Wall Street Journal article came out on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the restructuring. Whitmore heiress transforms husband's company into industry leader, the headline read, and despite the possessive error in the headline, it had never been Daniel's company. The article was surprisingly fair. It detailed Meridian Holdings' transformation under my leadership. Revenue up 18%. Debt reduced by 30%. 3 new strategic partnerships in markets we'd been trying to penetrate for years. Employee satisfaction scores up across the board after we'd cleaned house and promoted people based on competence rather than their willingness to flatter the CEO. The article mentioned Daniel only in passing, noting that former CEO Daniel Clark declined to comment for this story. What it didn't mention was that Daniel had started a consulting firm that was struggling to find clients, or that Sierra Taylor had moved to California and was working for a startup that would probably fail, or that the Connecticut property had been sold before he could buy it. I sat in my office, the real CEO office now, not the supportive spouse desk I'd occupied before, reading the article while drinking the coffee that Caroline brought me every morning. Caroline had become invaluable as my executive assistant, organized and fiercely loyal, protecting my time and managing my schedule with military efficiency. "Your 9 o'clock is here," she said, poking her head in. "Miss Chan from the Asian Development Fund. Send her in." The meeting was about expanding Meridian's presence in Southeast Asian markets, a strategic move I'd been planning for months. No more pretending our capital came from mysterious overseas investors. We were building real partnerships with real transparency, the kind that could survive scrutiny. Emma was thriving, surprisingly. The divorce had been hard on her at first, but kids are resilient in ways adults forget to be. She saw Daniel every other weekend, and while their relationship would never be what it could have been, it was honest now. No more distracted dad pretending to care while checking his phone. When Daniel had Emma, he actually focused on her, perhaps because he'd learned the cost of not paying attention to what mattered. She'd even started playing violin again, the instrument she'd nearly given up during those final months before everything changed. Last week, she'd performed a solo at her school concert, and both Daniel and I had been there, sitting on opposite sides of the auditorium, but united in our pride for our daughter. Mother called as I was reviewing the financial projections for next quarter. "Did you see the journal article?" she asked. I did. "They got the headline wrong, but the content is decent." "Your grandmother would have loved this," Mother said, and I could hear the pride in her voice. "Helen always said the Whitmore women were the real power behind the family fortune, and you've proven it." "I just did what needed to be done." "No, dear. You did what few people have the courage to do. You demanded the credit you deserved, you refused to accept betrayal gracefully, and you built something real from the ruins of someone else's fiction. That takes more than courage. It takes vision." After we hung up, I stood at my office window, looking out over the city. The same view Daniel had photographed 1,000 times for his social media, always positioning himself in front of it like a conqueror surveying his kingdom. But the kingdom had never been his. It had been built with Whitmore money, sustained by Whitmore backing, and saved by a Whitmore woman who finally stopped pretending otherwise. I thought about that morning 6 months ago, standing in my bathrobe with Emma's violin music in my hand, hearing Daniel tell me it was just business. How small I'd felt in that moment, how powerless, how completely unprepared for what was coming. But I'd been wrong about being unprepared. I'd spent 7 years learning every detail of Meridian's operations, understanding its financial architecture, building relationships with investors and board members. I'd been preparing without knowing I was preparing, positioning myself without realizing I'd eventually need to act. The Whitmore women had always been the invisible architects of family success, building empires while men took credit. But I'd changed that pattern. I'd stopped being invisible. I'd taken credit, claimed power, and demanded recognition. And I'd built something real. Meridian Holdings wasn't just surviving under my leadership. It was thriving, growing, becoming the company it always could have been if ego and lies hadn't gotten in the way. My phone buzzed. Margaret, sending me a photo from the estate. Our grandmother's portrait hanging in the library, with a new brass plaque beneath it. Helen Whitmore, builder of empires, breaker of chains. Mother had commissioned it last month, insisting it was time the family acknowledged what Helen had done instead of just remembering her for her charity work. The inscription was bold, almost aggressive, completely unlike the genteel historical markers usually associated with family matriarchs. But it was true. Helen had built empires, and she'd broken the chains of women's expected silence. Now I'd done the same. The architect of every dollar that flowed through Meridian Holdings, I whispered to myself, remembering the words I'd thought that first morning. Not Daniel. Me. Always me. And now everyone knew it. I turned back to my desk, where a stack of acquisition proposals waited for review. A new software company in Boston that could complement our existing services. A data analytics firm in Austin that had technology we needed. A European consulting group that would give us entry into markets we'd been eyeing for years. Real growth. Real strategy. Real success built on transparency and competence rather than borrowed money and lies. This was what I'd fought for. Not revenge, though that had been satisfying in its own way. Not even justice, though there'd been plenty of that. I'd fought for the truth. For the recognition that I'd earned. For the right to build something real with my own hands instead of watching someone else take credit. And I'd won. As I reached for the first proposal, I caught sight of the photo on my desk. Not the wedding photo that used to sit there, not the family portrait with Daniel's hand possessively on my shoulder. This was a new photo, Emma and me at her last violin concert, both of us laughing, both of us free. The old Lydia would have kept that wedding photo up, maintaining the fiction of a happy marriage even as it crumbled around her. She would have smiled through the betrayal, accepted the dismissal, let someone else define her worth. But the old Lydia was gone. She'd disappeared somewhere between withdrawal notices and board meetings, between evidence folders and emergency votes. In her place stood Lydia Whitmore, CEO, mother, architect of her own empire. And she was done pretending to be anything less.